Welcome back, I'm Shane and this is Relative Time. One of my favorite watches from last year was the Reise Resolute. It's a really cool, unique take on a field watch with a really well-made titanium case. Now, since that release, Reise has not only changed their name to RZE, but as of February 1st, they will be launching their second watch, the Endeavour, which shares a lot of the same design language with the Resolute, but in dive watch form. And this does include a grade 2 titanium case with an extra scratch-resistant coating, and that Endeavour is what we are going to be looking at today. One thing to bear in mind as we really get into this is that this watch is a prototype that was lent in for a few weeks. As far as I know, there won't be any major changes, but prototypes aren't always perfect. Also, you might have noticed that sponsor tag at the beginning. That's there because right before the holidays, RZE unexpectedly offered to send me a Resolute as a thank you after its own review. Since I'll be mentioning the Resolute and showing it off a few times, I thought it was safe just to include that tag. Now, just like the Resolute, this is a pure tool watch at heart, and as such they went with a moderate-sized case for a diver, with this 40.5 without and 42.5 with the crown, as well as a lug-to-lug here right around 46. So this should be a good fit for most people, and if you happen to have a Resolute, I'm pretty sure the case is almost identical. The only real difference I've noticed is in the total thickness, with the Endeavour being a little thicker at 12.5, which isn't bad for an automatic and pretty good for a 200-meter diver with a Seiko NH38 movement. You also have a standard 20mm lug width, a flat sapphire with a ton of AR coating, and a paltry weight of around 100 grams on its titanium bracelet. And size for my 7-inch wrist, I think it actually came in at 98 grams, which is one of the things I really love about the Endeavour. If you're not used to titanium watches, when you first pick this thing up, you will be amazed at how lightweight it is. And that's also one of the big reasons why this is so comfortable on the wrist. With the titanium bracelet, it sits squarely on my wrist while being nicely balanced, yet only weighs a little bit more than a steel diver with a rubber strap. The other reason that this is so comfortable is in the design of the bracelet. It's a fully articulating H-link titanium bracelet that just perfectly conforms to your wrist. Starts at 20, then tapers down to a slim 16 for extra comfort. It has solid end links, solid links, and a milled clasp, as well as it's also treated to the same finish and protective coating as the case. So it's almost a perfect match, and the only thing that's really holding it back is that it uses a friction release and not a push button. But other than that, it's pretty fantastic. The case itself is pretty similar, if not identical to that of the Resolute, which is to say the overall design is a bit different. It's very modern and very industrial, with these various flat angled edges that are protruding out. Yet the entire case has the same smooth-to-the-touch bead-blasted finish. There's only two major differences I noticed between the two cases. The first is a deeper, more extended case spec, and the other is of course the diver's timing bezel. Turning the watch over, you can see that the case back is very blank and pretty generic. Personally, I'd like something here, but it also kind of reinforces the all-business tool watch motif. And that also extends to the bezel itself. Now, as far as I can tell, this isn't any kind of insert, but a one-piece all-titanium bezel, which, when you're not using it to time anything, can double as an extended minute track or the chapter ring underneath the sapphire. And even though it isn't very tall, the coin edge makes it surprisingly easy to get a grip. It's also 120 click, unidirectional, with a pretty good action and no backplay. However, there are two things to note here. The first is that since this is titanium, it has a slightly different feel as you turn it. It's not bad, just different, with a slightly more hollow sound. The other is that this bezel is misaligned, and this is something you might have already noticed. But as I pointed out, this is a prototype, so hopefully the production models will be just fine. Looking to the side, you can see the drilled lugs, which are always a nice touch, as well as the signed screw-down crown that is sticking out of those angular crown guards. Even though it doesn't stick out very far, it's always easy to get a hold of and use. This all brings us to the dial. Rather than the flat fume that's on the Resolute, the Endeavour has a single color that stretches across a sand-textured dial. At launch, I think there are going to be 4 different colorways, with this one, the Frigate Gray, being the most conservative, while the Medallion Yellow is going to be the most attention-grabbing. On the outer edge, we have a chapter ring painted on in white. It's made up of dashes for the minute track and dots for the hour marks, except for the 4 cardinal points, which are thicker squares at the 3, 6, and 9, and an upside-down triangle at the 12. It's kind of a small thing, but those cardinal points combined with their corresponding indices create a very subtle but very effective crosshair effect, which is in part due to those hour indicators being split with a very eye-catching light blue at its end. The hands are extended swords for the hour and minutes, and a very long extended lollipop for the second hand. Overall, they look good with the design, and I think they are a great length. The white lume on the hands stand out nicely against the gray backdrop, but I gotta say that the gunmetal gray framing can kind of fade into it, although that might only be a problem with this specific colorway. Now, it's always nice to have a touch of color, and in this particular case it can be very useful, but the pastel blue on these indices as well as the second hand kind of seem out of place with this dark gray dial, and perhaps much more suited towards the white dial version, yet it is something you can get used to. One of the things I loved about the Resolute was how the hands and the indices all interacted with the dial. Just how that charcoal black framing really looked against the lighter gray fume dial, as they immediately drew your eyes right towards them, and somehow gave the indices of the watch some needed depth as it showed off the different heights. Now, the same design language is used here on the Endeavour, and that effect is still here, just a whole lot more subtle with the darker gray textured dial. Although the watch is still rather easy to read, there's a ton of contrast here between the white elements and that darker gray dial. You'll also notice that there's no date on this watch, so it's very balanced and very symmetrical. At the bottom of the dial you have your standard text, while at the top you have your stylized R logo, which is one of the differences that they made after they changed their name. From previous comments, I know not everyone is going to like this logo, but I think it is better than using the RZE letters, and overall rather fitting with the modern look of the case. Moving on to the lume, we have a pretty cool design here. Only the triangle at the bezel is lumed, which is a little disappointing, but they did a great job mixing the blue for the inner dial and the green on the chapter ring. So in terms of a comparison, I threw it up against the Seiko Turtle, as well as to see how it does against the Resolute. And they all seem to fade out just about the same time, so I'd say the Endeavour's lume is pretty good. Now, unfortunately, it's not the extreme lume you see on a lot of other micro brands, and that is a little bit disappointing for the price, but for most people, it'll be perfectly fine. It's also a little bit odd to see a dive watch last just as long as its corresponding field watch, but the Resolute already had pretty good lume as it is. However, this all brings us to the movement, and this is where things get a little bit more complicated. The Endeavour uses a Seiko NH38A movement, which is pretty much the non-date version of an NH35A, so it's got pretty much everything you need and is a great entry-level movement. The complication, however, is that with an MSRP of $459, I wouldn't exactly say this is an entry-level watch. Now, when evaluating value, I always hate to base that value based solely on the movement, as there are a ton of different components that make up the cost of the watch, and especially so when you're talking titanium. But I do think there's a particular price range that's acceptable for each movement, and once exceeded, that movement becomes more of a liability than a good fit, which is pretty much what we have here. I mean, if this was a Miyota 9039 or a Swiss Edda or Solita movement, I don't think we'd be having this conversation, but it's not. So kinda is what it is here, which means the value proposition on this one isn't going to be the greatest. Now, if you really like the design of the Endeavour, I don't think that should keep you from buying it. It's just something to think about and be aware of when you're evaluating and comparing this to other watches you might like. And if you do like this more than any other, I don't think that should hold you back. After all, I can't think of anything else quite like the Endeavour. RZE really hit the nail on the head for what they were trying to accomplish here, which was to create an original, no-nonsense tool watch. It's well made, extremely lightweight, and very comfortable on the wrist, all while offering a clean, straightforward design. Like the Resolute that came before it, nothing on this watch has any sort of reflective surface. It's all business, so to speak. Yet it's still a diver that has a lot of wrist presence, although maybe not the kind of presence you might expect for a diver. And that's one of the other interesting factors to consider when looking at the Endeavour. That all-tool watch, all-brush design works perfectly on the Resolute because it's a field watch, as oftentimes that's what people expect for that type of watch. Yet when it comes to a diver, people say they want a tool watch, but they all seem to want one with a touch of flash, a sunburst dial, some chamfered edges, and applied reflective indices and hands. On divers, these features are more considered the norm and are often sought out. So I think the design approach here might limit its appeal, as some would look at the tool watchy Endeavour and just think it's too plain. Personally, I seem to be caught in the middle. While I generally prefer that touch of flash on my divers, I have found that there's something unique, cool, and rather modern about the Endeavour that is really hard to ignore. And especially when I put it on a leather strap, which I think really accentuated the angular titanium case. So just something to think about in terms of what kind of diver you prefer, or if you happen to be looking for something a little bit different than your normal diver. And to be fair, this is the same conundrum a lot of people face when they look at the Tudor Pelagos. Some people just love it for its tool watchy goodness, and others would rather have a black bay. So regardless of where you stand on the issue, I think the Endeavour is in good company. Anyway, that's my take on the RZE Endeavour, but let me know what you think about it down below, and specifically if you like it more or less than the Resolute. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.